Hey there, welcome to True Crime Records. Tonight, we're stepping into the legend of a man whose name refuses to fade. The real-life inspiration behind Joe Pesci's wild, unpredictable character. A figure some called fearless. And others whispered was simply out of control. Tommy DeSimone wasn't just another gangster. He was a storm in human form. Quick-tempered, impossible to predict. Wrapped in a confidence so intense it bordered on dangerous. But behind the jokes, the swagger, and the sudden bursts of violence, there was something more. A young man climbing the ranks of a world where loyalty was currency. And reputation meant survival. And then, almost overnight, he was gone. No body. No answers. No goodbye. A man who believed he was about to be made. Only to walk straight into one of the most mysterious disappearances in mob history. Before we dive deeper, drop a comment. And let me know where you're listening from. It's always incredible seeing this late-night true crime community stretch across states, countries, and time zones. Now settle in. Let the noise of the day slip away. And follow me into the shadows. This is True Crime Records. Your nighttime doorway into the underworld's most legendary stories. And if you enjoy these calm deep dive documentaries, don't forget to hit subscribe. There's a new story waiting for you every night. Chapter 1, Childhood Shadows, A Violent World Begins. Tommy DeSimone's story begins long before the headlines, long before the rumors, and long before Hollywood painted him into a legend. His life started inside the tightly woven, emotionally charged world of New York's Italian-American neighborhoods, a place where family meant everything, respect was currency, and tempers ran hot enough to burn through an entire generation. He was born into a world that felt like a small universe tucked inside a massive city. The sidewalks were busy, the voices loud, the families large, and the rules unwritten but understood by everyone. Children grew up with cousins who felt more like siblings, and neighbors who acted like extended family members. Loyalty was expected. Toughness was admired. Pride was defended fiercely. From the outside, it looked like a tight-knit community full of warmth, tradition, and belonging. But beneath that surface was a tension that shaped every boy who grew up there, including Tommy. Losing your temper wasn't a failure, it was a response. Matching energy wasn't unnecessary, it was survival. In these neighborhoods, kids learned early that the world respected confidence, and punished hesitation. Tommy was the youngest in a family deeply connected to organized crime. His uncles, cousins, and older relatives were part of the life. They didn't hide it, not really, it was simply the air the family breathed. Conversations whispered at kitchen tables, unexplained absences, money that came and went without explanation, these were normal pieces of the puzzle Tommy grew up watching. Even as a child, he sensed that the men around him lived by rules different from the rest of the city. People described him as bright, charismatic, and funny. He had a presence that filled a room even when he was young, loud laughter, fast talking, and a grin that appeared at the slightest opportunity. But underneath that charm was something else, a short fuse, an intensity that snapped without warning, a tendency to take things personally even when no offense was meant. Adults sometimes brushed it off as typical neighborhood temperament. Kids around him learned to navigate it. Tommy didn't grow up dreaming of a normal life. School wasn't a place where he found direction, it was a place where he felt confined. Teachers remembered him as restless, easily distracted, and uninterested in anything that didn't feel immediate. He wasn't drawn to books or lessons, he was drawn to movement, excitement, adrenaline. The streets offered that in ways school never could. By the time Tommy was a teenager, the world around him had already imagined his future. It wasn't spoken out loud, but everyone knew. Boys like him, lively, fearless, deeply tied to the community, often drifted into the life long before they understood its consequences. He saw older men being respected, their names spoken with a mix of admiration and caution. He watched them drive nice cars, wear sharp clothes, and walk with the confidence that comes from being feared. It left an impression. His early mentors weren't teachers or coaches. They were neighborhood guys on corners, older friends who already had one foot in the door, and relatives who treated him like a son even when their guidance came with danger attached. He ran errands, carried packages, delivered messages. Small things, but things that made him feel included. Things that told him he was part of something bigger. By his mid-teens, Tommy had developed the traits that would define him for the rest of his life: fierce loyalty to the people he admired, explosive unpredictability when he felt disrespected, and a fearless enthusiasm for risk. In a place where boldness was rewarded, Tommy's recklessness stood out. He wasn't cautious. He wasn't measured. He didn't wait for permission. Those around him noticed, some with pride, others with unease. But Tommy wasn't simply a product of the streets. He carried an emotional restlessness that never really left him. He moved through life like someone who didn't expect to live long, someone who didn't plan far ahead, someone who prioritized the moment over the future. He loved deeply and reacted sharply. He could be warm one minute, then ice cold the next. Consistency wasn't part of his nature. Friends often said that Tommy had two modes, laughter and anger, and the switch between them was instantaneous. One moment he'd be slapping someone's back, telling a joke, or flashing that trademark grin; the next, he'd be tense, jaw tight, eyes narrowed in a way that made even his closest friends think twice. It wasn't that he enjoyed conflict, it was that conflict never frightened him. And in the world he grew up in, fearlessness could be a ticket in, and a coffin lid waiting to close. Tommy's environment shaped him, but it didn't explain him completely. Many boys grew up in that same neighborhood without developing the same volatility. Many kids watched uncles slip into back rooms without becoming unpredictable men. But Tommy had a combination of traits that made him unique: charisma, fearlessness, loyalty, and a lack of emotional breaks. A personality built for fast-moving chaos. By his late teens, the path ahead of him was no longer a possibility, it was a certainty. He was too deeply connected, too known, too recognized for his potential. The Lucchese family saw him as valuable. Men like Jimmy Burke saw him as usable. Henry Hill saw him as both entertaining and terrifying. Tommy didn't walk into the mob world. He drifted into it naturally. Like someone simply following the current of the only river he had ever known. His childhood didn't create the violence that would later define his reputation, but it built the foundation. A life where intensity was normal. Loyalty was survival. And anger was simply another language spoken fluently by everyone around him. This was Tommy before the headlines. Before the heists. Before the paranoia. Before the legend. Just a boy shaped by a world where the line between loyalty and danger was almost invisible, and where crossing it felt like destiny. Chapter 2, Becoming a Street Soldier, First Steps into the Mob. By the time Tommy DeSimone reached his late teens, the streets of East New York felt less like a neighborhood and more like a training ground. The rules were unwritten, but everyone understood them. Respect the right people. Keep your eyes open. Never talk out of turn. And above all else, loyalty wasn't optional. It was the only currency that mattered. Tommy absorbed these lessons long before anyone formally welcomed him into the life. He picked them up through observation. Through the quiet nods exchanged between older men. Through the way shop owners greeted certain people with deference. Through the subtle power dynamic that existed everywhere: who stepped aside, who walked first, who spoke softly but commanded a room without trying. He didn't need formal education to understand hierarchy. The streets taught him everything he needed. As a teenager, Tommy became a fixture in the local social clubs, places that looked like simple neighborhood hangouts to outsiders but were actually hubs of information, deals, and influence. Inside these smoky back rooms, card tables were surrounded by men who ran scams, hijacked trucks, and loaned money at rates no bank would dare match. To Tommy, these places felt like home. He served coffee, picked up packages, delivered envelopes. All small tasks, but important ones. In the mob, trust was built through repetition, through reliability, through presence. And Tommy was always present. He wasn't shy. He wasn't afraid. And he wasn't nervous around men who would make most people tremble. If anything, he seemed energized by the environment, amused by the chaos, fascinated by the shifting alliances, and eager to prove himself. For someone like Tommy, the mob wasn't a career choice. It was validation. It was belonging. Older wise guys noticed him immediately. Not just because of his family name, but because of his personality. Tommy had a way of carrying himself that was impossible to ignore. He spoke fast, laughed loud, and moved with the restless energy of someone who always felt a step ahead of the room. Some admired it. Some kept their distance. But very few underestimated him. When he ran errands, he did them fast. When he was trusted with money, it always reached the right hands. When he was sent to deliver a message, he didn't repeat anything extra. He was loyal, efficient, and attentive, qualities that earned him small bits of responsibility long before he was old enough to legally drink. His first real break came through the men who hovered around Robert's Lounge, a seemingly ordinary bar that acted as the unofficial headquarters for Jimmy Burke. This was where deals were made, shipments discussed, and long-term plans whispered in the corners. For Tommy, entering Jimmy's orbit was like stepping into the major leagues of his world. Jimmy Burke wasn't a boss, but he was powerful, charismatic, sharp, and ambitious in a way that made him something like an unofficial mentor to young men who wanted to rise. Tommy admired him. More importantly, Jimmy recognized something dangerous and useful in Tommy, a willingness to act without overthinking. Henry Hill, who hung around the same circles, later described Tommy as fearless in a way that made everyone else a little nervous. But back then, that fearlessness was exactly what made him valuable. Tommy's earliest responsibilities involved small-time schemes, unloading hijacked trucks, guarding shipments, running messages between crews, and providing muscle when needed. Nothing glamorous, but everything essential. These jobs taught him how the criminal ecosystem worked, who mattered, who didn't, and how important timing was in every operation. He learned how to blend into crowds, how to spot police without drawing attention, how to read body language, and how to negotiate with people who assumed a teenage boy couldn't possibly have authority. Jimmy often tested him with errands that required quick thinking. Henry sometimes brought him along on small hustles just to watch how he reacted under pressure. And Tommy never disappointed them. But there was something else happening beneath the surface, something even Tommy didn't fully understand. Every time he was given a task that involved confrontation, he felt a sense of purpose. Every tense situation energized him, sharpened him. Where others hesitated, Tommy jumped. Where others calculated risk, Tommy acted on instinct. It made him effective, but it also made him unpredictable. Older men noticed the duality. Tommy's loyal, they'd say. But you never know which version of him you'll get. In the world he entered, unpredictability could be a weapon, or a liability. Tommy's reputation grew slowly at first. People saw him as a kid with potential. A kid who could handle himself. A kid who wasn't scared of anyone. But as he proved himself again and again, that perception changed. Soon, he wasn't a kid anymore. He was an associate, young, but no longer overlooked. Jimmy Burke in particular began to rely on him. Not because Tommy was older or experienced, but because he was bold enough to do what others hesitated to. Still, in these early years, Tommy looked at Jimmy with admiration. He wanted to impress him. He wanted to be seen as reliable, strong, capable. Jimmy had a way of making young men feel like they belonged. Like they were part of something meaningful. Henry Hill, too, was part of the dynamic, though his relationship with Tommy was far more complex. They laughed together, worked together, and lived through moments that would later become famous through film. But Henry always kept a mental note of Tommy's volatility. He respected him, liked him even, but he never let his guard down. As Tommy matured, his clothing changed. His posture changed. His mannerisms became sharper. He learned how to stand in a room without speaking and still be noticed. He learned how to read a situation with a single glance. He learned who deserved respect, who didn't, and when to walk away. But he also learned something more dangerous. That fear could accomplish what words couldn't. That reputation could open doors faster than negotiation. And that a single impulsive decision could echo for years. The seeds of his downfall were planted even during these early years, not through major events, but through patterns, a temperament that could shift instantly, a pride that refused to bend, a loyalty that sometimes clouded judgment. By the end of his teenage years, Tommy DeSimone had transformed from a kid running errands to a trusted associate who moved through New York's criminal world with the swagger of someone twice his age. His name began to circulate quietly. People noticed when he entered a room. They lowered their voices when he walked past. Some respected him. Some feared him. Many did both. He was still young. Still learning. Still climbing. But the path he was on, paved by loyalty, adrenaline, and instinct, would eventually lead him toward places even he couldn't predict. The boy who grew up surrounded by shadows was now creating shadows of his own. And the world he stepped into was ready to use him, shape him, and ultimately destroy him. Chapter 3, The Lucchese Family Opens Its Doors. By the time Tommy DeSimone entered his early 20s, the criminal world that once felt like a distant orbit had become the center of his life. He no longer hovered on the edges, watching older men move through smoky rooms and whispered conversations. Now, he stood among them. He wasn't officially part of the Lucchese family, only born Italians could be made, but he was close enough to feel the gravitational pull of the organization. And it all began with two men, Jimmy Burke and Henry Hill. Jimmy was the son of their crew, calm on the surface, calculating underneath, and always thinking 10 steps ahead. Henry was the bridge between personalities, smoother, more diplomatic, a natural mediator. And then there was Tommy, the force of nature who barreled through life with energy that felt both captivating and dangerous. Together, they formed a trio that would define a decade of New York's underworld. Jimmy saw potential in Tommy long before anyone else did. He liked young men who were hungry, loyal, and uninhibited by fear. Men who didn't hesitate. Who didn't stall. Men who gave their full weight to a decision once it was made. Tommy wasn't just good for the work Jimmy had in mind, he was perfect for it. Henry, on the other hand, saw Tommy differently. He recognized the charm, the humor, the loyal streak that kept Tommy tight with the people he respected. But he also saw the spark in Tommy's eyes, a spark that could turn into fire with very little provocation. Henry admired him, but he also kept a quiet distance, always watching for the shift in tone that could turn an ordinary moment into something unpredictable. Still, despite their different perspectives, both men helped bring Tommy fully into the orbit of the Lucchese family's operations. Jimmy's introduction was simple. He took Tommy to meetings, introduced him to associates, vouched for his reliability, and slowly expanded the responsibilities he handed him. With each errand completed and each task handled, Jimmy gained confidence. Tommy understood the importance of loyalty. He didn't ask questions. He didn't hesitate. He didn't try to impress anyone with words, he let his actions speak. Henry played a different role in Tommy's development. He taught him how to blend in when blending in mattered. How to read people during tense conversations. How to move casually through airports, bars, and social clubs without drawing attention. How to stay calm when the job required quietness rather than force. Tommy needed both influences, the boldness Jimmy inspired and the finesse Henry modeled. Without them, he might have drifted into reckless, directionless street crime. With them, he became part of an organized structure that rewarded loyalty and punished ego. The first time Tommy truly felt the weight of Lucchese power was during a gathering at Robert's Lounge, the unofficial headquarters of Jimmy's crew. The bar was dim, smoke curling through the air like a slow-moving fog. Cards slapped against the table. Laughter rose from the back room. A jukebox hummed faintly under the chatter. Tommy wasn't there as a kid running errands anymore. He was invited, expected, included. Jimmy spoke to him like an equal. Henry treated him like a friend. And other associates offered nods of acknowledgement, nods that meant he had passed the unspoken tests of trustworthiness. He was becoming part of a system, not formally, but socially, practically, and spiritually. In the mob world, sometimes that mattered more. The Lucchese family didn't induct associates through official ceremonies. Most never became made men. But affiliation was built through proximity, through shared work, shared secrets, shared risks. And Tommy was slowly being absorbed into that world through every job, every late-night meeting, every quiet conversation spoken in half-shadow. Over time, he met more men from the family's inner circle. Some liked him. Some feared him. Some didn't know what to make of him. One thing everyone agreed on. Tommy wasn't neutral. He carried presence, loud, crackling, unpredictable, an energy that pulled attention whether he wanted it or not. He became the type of associate people whispered about. Not always negative whispers, but whispers nonetheless. He's loyal, someone might say. But he's got a temper. He's sharp, another might add. But don't cross him. He works hard, someone else would remark. But he acts before he thinks. In the mob, reputation moved faster than truth. And Tommy's reputation was developing its own momentum. His first major job with Jimmy and Henry was a test, a simple one, but a test nevertheless. It involved collecting money, smoothing over an argument between two small-time gamblers, and making sure both men walked away convinced of Jimmy's dominance. Most young associates would have been nervous. Tommy wasn't. He walked into the situation with a confidence that made even older wise guys raise an eyebrow. He listened carefully, spoke clearly, and followed Jimmy's subtle cues without hesitation. There was no overreaction, no unnecessary escalation. He performed the job exactly as expected. Jimmy was impressed. Henry was surprised. Even Tommy seemed to sense that something had shifted. He had stepped out of the shadows and into the actual machinery of the mob. And the machinery welcomed him. But with that acceptance came something else, expectation. The mob didn't give without taking. The Lucchese family offered opportunities, money, protection, and a sense of belonging. In return, they demanded loyalty, secrecy, and the willingness to follow orders without question. Tommy understood this bargain intuitively. He had been raised in its proximity his entire life. And he accepted it without hesitation. He started spending more nights at Jimmy's side, more afternoons running errands that held more weight, more mornings checking in with Henry to see what tasks needed doing. His days became long, filled with movement, deals, and conversations that required equal parts charm and awareness. He learned how to navigate the hierarchy, who to greet first, who to avoid, who to listen to, who to ignore. He learned the rules of conversation, the rules of silence, the rules of respect. He learned when to stand back and when to step forward. The streets didn't teach these lessons. The men did. Jimmy taught him how to act with intention. Henry taught him how to act with clarity. And together, they shaped him into someone the family could use, someone young, loyal, fearless, and committed. But even as he grew in status, there was a restlessness in Tommy that never quite disappeared. He moved through the world with a mixture of excitement and impatience, always reaching, always wanting more, always eager for the next challenge. Being an associate wasn't enough. He wanted something bigger. He wanted the respect that came with being untouchable. He wanted to rise, to prove himself, to step into rooms where only true insiders were allowed. And that hunger, the ambition that glowed quietly beneath his bravado, would eventually drive him closer to the most dangerous parts of the mob world. For now, though, he was rising. Learning. Earning trust. Building a reputation that grew each day. The Lucchese family had opened its doors to him. And Tommy DeSimone had walked through without looking back. His path was set. His role was forming. And the world he was entering was far more dangerous than he realized. Chapter 4: A Reputation Built on Fear. By the mid-1970s, Tommy DeSimone had carved out a reputation that spread through the underworld faster than any official introduction ever could. He wasn't a made man, he wasn't a capo, and he wasn't someone with deep organizational authority. But none of that mattered. In his world, influence didn't come from titles. It came from presence. And Tommy had presence in a way that few young associates ever did. It wasn't just what he did, it was how he carried himself. The confidence. The intensity. The quick smile that could shift suddenly into silence. The way he paced when restless. The way he laughed when others hesitated. People who spent time around him learned something quickly. Tommy was unpredictable, not in a wild, chaotic way, but in a tightly wound, coiled spring sort of way. His emotions moved fast. His patience was thin. And his loyalty, though genuine, was wrapped in a fierceness that made challenging him dangerous. This unpredictability became a quiet weapon. A psychological tool. People thought twice before crossing him because they never knew how he would react. In the mob world, fear and respect often blended together, forming something powerful: influence without rank, authority without ceremony. Tommy had that. He earned it through presence, through fearlessness, through the kind of confidence that came from never second-guessing himself. And that alone made him valuable. In Robert's Lounge, the unofficial headquarters of Jimmy Burke's operations, Tommy became a fixture. The bar had the energy of a home base: cheap drinks, dim lighting, a back room where plans were whispered, and a rotation of familiar faces who understood the unwritten rules of the life. Tommy didn't just belong there, he thrived there. He'd walk into the lounge with a briskness that made people look up. He'd greet Jimmy first, always, then make his way around the room. Sometimes he'd be funny, telling stories with a rapid-fire charm that made people lean in. Other times he'd sit quietly at a table, cigarette in hand, simply watching the room with sharp eyes. People respected him because they couldn't predict him. But people also liked him, because when he was calm, he was incredibly charismatic. Henry Hill often said that Tommy could go from hilarious to hostile in seconds. But he also admitted that, on good days, Tommy was one of the funniest people he'd ever met. He could imitate accents, tell stories, and make even hardened mob guys double over with laughter. That combination, humor and danger, created a magnetism around him. Men who lived through stress and fear daily needed someone who could make them laugh. But they also needed someone who could handle pressure without hesitation. Tommy did both. But a reputation built on fear came with downsides. People kept their distance emotionally. They didn't confide in him. They didn't get too close. They didn't relax fully around him unless they were sure of his mood. Tommy, however, didn't notice this distance, or perhaps didn't care. He lived moment to moment. Friends were people who stood beside him. Loyalty meant everything. And emotional caution? That wasn't part of his vocabulary. Still, that intensity created tension even among those closest to him. Jimmy admired Tommy but worried about him. Henry liked Tommy but feared him in quiet ways. Other associates respected him but avoided provoking him. In the mob, where stability meant survival, Tommy's volatility could be a blessing in the moment, and a curse in the long run. One thing that cemented Tommy's reputation was his reactiveness. He didn't let things slide. He didn't overlook disrespect. He didn't brush off insults, whether intentional or accidental. In the Mafia world, respect wasn't optional. It was currency. It was protection. It was survival. And Tommy protected his pride fiercely. If someone spoke to him sharply, Tommy responded immediately. If someone made a joke at his expense, he didn't laugh it off. If someone tried to intimidate him, he doubled down. His pride wasn't fragile, it was powerful, constantly guarded by a temperament that flared without warning. And because the streets valued strength, his reactions weren't seen as weakness. They were seen as proof that Tommy couldn't be pushed around. Men who might have challenged someone else thought twice before challenging him. Jimmy Burke quietly kept Tommy close because he understood one thing. Tommy could be relied upon to show up, no matter the situation. Need someone to intimidate a stubborn debtor? Tommy was there. Need someone to accompany a tense meeting? Tommy didn't flinch. Need someone to show presence in a room full of strangers? Tommy didn't hesitate. Fearless men were rare. Fearless and loyal men were rarer. And Tommy, despite his faults, was loyal to the people he respected, Jimmy most of all. Henry Hill's relationship with Tommy was slightly different. Henry was calmer, more measured, more observant. He kept the peace when possible, eased tensions when needed, and let Tommy take the lead when force or intensity was required. Their personalities balanced each other, Henry the negotiator, Tommy the enforcer. Tommy's aura grew even outside Jimmy's circle. Associates from other families heard about him. His name circulated in conversations. People who had never met him had opinions. That kid's wild. That kid's loyal. That kid's got no brakes. Reputations in the Mafia were like smoke, once released into the world, they drifted far and fast. And Tommy's reputation, shaped by countless small moments rather than one big incident, became part of the city's criminal atmosphere. The irony was that Tommy himself didn't think much about how others saw him. He wasn't building a brand. He wasn't calculating how to climb. He acted naturally, impulsively, confidently, intensely, and the world reacted around him. Some admired him. Some feared him. Some stayed out of his way. But the name, Tommy DeSimone, began carrying weight, not because he was powerful in rank, but because he was powerful in presence. And yet, beneath all the bravado, Tommy wasn't invincible. His volatility, the same trait that won him respect, also placed targets on his back. The Mafia valued loyalty, discipline, and predictability, and men who acted on emotion could create instability. Even Jimmy sometimes wondered if Tommy's temper would eventually cause problems they couldn't fix. Even Henry sensed that Tommy's energy was like a fuse burning steadily towards something explosive. Tommy didn't see the danger developing around him. He only saw the momentum, the reputation, the respect, the rising status. But in the Mafia, rising too fast made people nervous. Being too unpredictable made people cautious. Being too feared could easily shift into being too risky. And risk was something mob families did not tolerate indefinitely. Tommy was building a reputation that elevated him, and at the same time nudged him closer to forces that would one day turn against him. For now, though, he stood tall, confident, and unstoppable. A young man with dangerous charisma, a short fuse, and a name people whispered when he walked past. He had become a force. A presence. A personality that shaped rooms, shaped deals, shaped the dynamics of his crew. But in the world he inhabited, a reputation built on fear was a double-edged blade. One that impressed allies, angered rivals, and eventually invited consequences. Tommy couldn't see the consequences coming. But the first sparks that would ignite his downfall were already quietly burning in the background. Chapter 5, Life at Robert's Lounge, Jimmy's headquarters. To understand Tommy DeSimone's rise, you have to understand Robert's Lounge, the beating heart of Jimmy Burke's world. The bar wasn't famous on the outside. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't even particularly noticeable. Just another Queens watering hole tucked between corner stores and brick apartment buildings, its neon sign flickering like a tired heartbeat in the night. But inside, Robert's Lounge felt like the center of gravity for an entire criminal ecosystem. The smell of cigarette smoke hung permanently in the air. Glasses clinked softly behind the bar. A jukebox hummed in the background, playing old doo-wop tunes and Sinatra ballads that floated like ghosts through the dimly lit room. The regulars didn't need to look around, they knew every face, every shadow, every voice. This was Jimmy's turf. His headquarters. His quiet kingdom. And for Tommy, it became a second home. The days at Robert's Lounge were deceptively peaceful. Jimmy often sat at his usual table, same spot, same chair, leaning back with a cigarette balanced between his fingers, eyes half on the room and half on whatever delicate deal was unfolding. He spoke softly, rarely raising his voice, because power didn't need volume. It needed presence. And Jimmy had presence the moment he walked through the door. Men approached him with respect, almost reverence. They lowered their voices. They leaned in. They chose their words carefully. And behind them, Tommy often took his place, standing casually, hands in his pockets, observing everything with a restless, attentive energy. He wasn't Jimmy's bodyguard. He wasn't his enforcer. He wasn't his right-hand man. But he was always there. And that alone made him important. In a world where gathering spots doubled as power centers, proximity meant influence. And Tommy was always in Jimmy's orbit. Henry Hill drifted in and out of the lounge with the confidence of someone who knew the routine. He'd strut in, greet the bartender, slide into a booth, and exchange quick updates with Jimmy. Sometimes he came in with a grin, sometimes exhausted, sometimes carrying the weight of a dozen small hustles he'd been juggling. When Henry and Tommy were both there, the energy shifted. Henry brought balance. Tommy brought electricity. Together they were the pulse of the younger crowd, laughing, teasing, making plans, and occasionally slipping into long silences whenever conversations turned serious. For the older associates, watching them interact was like seeing a preview of the future. Henry, the strategic thinker. Tommy, the force of nature. Both loyal to Jimmy. Both deeply connected to the Lucchese orbit. Robert's Lounge wasn't just a hangout. It was a classroom. A command center. A testing ground. Young men learned lessons there that no school could teach. How to read someone's intentions with a single glance. How to tell when a man was lying. How to negotiate without appearing desperate. How to make someone feel respected, or intimidated, without saying a word. Tommy absorbed these lessons intuitively. He had a good memory for faces, a sharp instinct for tension, and an ability to sense when something was off. Jimmy noticed this early on. Henry noticed it too. Tommy wasn't book smart, but he was environment smart, a skill that mattered far more in their world. He learned how deals were made. How debts were collected. How favors were traded quietly. How alliances were built through small gestures. And how one wrong move could fracture a relationship beyond repair. But the lounge also revealed Tommy's limits. Certain situations required diplomacy, a calm tone, a neutral expression, a willingness to absorb disrespect without reacting. Those were Henry's strengths, not Tommy's. Jimmy often handled delicate matters himself, sending Tommy outside or having him wait at the bar while negotiations took place. Not because Tommy was incapable, but because his presence could shift the energy too quickly. Still, even sitting at the bar, Tommy was studying every detail, the tone of voices, the timing of reactions, the way men leaned forward or leaned back depending on their comfort. He learned which gestures showed confidence and which showed fear. He learned that silence could be intimidating. He learned that the phrase, "we'll talk later," could mean a dozen different things depending on who said it. Tommy wasn't a student in school, but at Robert's lounge, he became a student of human nature. Robert's wasn't always business, though. Some nights were long, loud, and heavy with laughter. The jukebox played songs that made older men nostalgic, tapping their fingers on the table. Rounds of drinks arrived without anyone taking credit for buying them. Jokes rolled through the room like waves. Someone would start telling a story from 20 years earlier, exaggerated beyond reality, and the room erupted. Tommy thrived during those nights. He was quick with impressions, quick with one-liners, quick to turn an ordinary moment into a room-wide laugh. Even men who didn't particularly trust him couldn't deny his charisma. There was something magnetic about him when he was relaxed, a boyish, mischievous charm that made him feel like the life of the party. But the same charm that lit up a room could darken it instantly if someone said the wrong thing. Tommy didn't handle teasing well. He didn't handle disrespect at all. And he didn't differentiate between harmless jokes and genuine threats. In his mind, they were all the same, challenges that needed immediate correction. Those moments made the room tighten. Men exchanged glances. Jimmy would shoot him a warning look. Henry would try to change the subject. Because at Robert's lounge, reputation mattered, and rumors spread quickly. Despite the tension, most of the crew accepted Tommy completely. Not just because he was loyal, but because he had something many young associates lacked: heart. He defended his friends fiercely. He protected Jimmy with unquestioning devotion. He watched Henry's back even when Henry didn't realize it. For all his flaws, Tommy cared deeply. Too deeply. And that emotional intensity shaped every part of his life: friendships, loyalty, ambition, and eventually conflict. He wasn't a cold, calculating criminal. He was emotional, reactive, and deeply tied to the people he loved. And in the Mafia, emotion was a liability. Still, Jimmy valued Tommy's heart because it made him trustworthy. Henry valued it because it made him human. Others valued it because it made him predictable in one specific way. Tommy always stood with his own. One of the biggest lessons Tommy learned at Robert's lounge was the power of routine. The mob thrived on unpredictability with outsiders but relied on consistency within their circle. Meetings were held at the same times. Drinks were ordered the same way. Calls came at predictable hours. Deals progressed through predictable steps. Tommy began modeling his life around those rhythms. He woke up late. He drifted into the lounge by early afternoon. He checked in with Jimmy or Henry. He handled whatever tasks were assigned. He came back at night to unwind, laugh, talk, absorb. Day after day. Month after month. Year after year. Robert's lounge didn't just shape his behavior. It shaped his identity. It gave him a sense of belonging. A sense of purpose. A sense of being part of something bigger than himself. But it also gave him something dangerous. A sense of invincibility. Because in that dimly lit room, surrounded by allies and mentors, Tommy felt protected. Untouchable. Important. And believing you're untouchable is one of the most dangerous illusions in the Mafia. Tommy didn't realize that while the lounge elevated him, it also exposed him. Every move he made was observed. Every shift in his behavior was noticed. Every decision added a new line to the quiet ledger that the Mafia kept on every associate. Jimmy saw him rising. Henry saw him maturing. Others saw him becoming more volatile. But Tommy himself only saw the present. The laughter, the responsibilities, the long nights. The sense of belonging. Robert's lounge gave him a place in the world. And it laid the foundation for everything that would follow. The glory, the paranoia, the betrayal. And the eventual disappearance that made him a ghost in mob history. His life was accelerating. And the lounge, for better or worse, was the engine. Chapter 6, The Air Cargo Rackets, Money, Power, and Rising Stakes. By the time Tommy DeSimone settled fully into Jimmy Burke's orbit, the criminal landscape around JFK Airport had become the backbone of their entire operation. Most of New York never realized just how much money passed through those air cargo terminals, not just legal shipments, but cash, jewels, electronics, foreign goods, luxury items, and all the small fortunes tucked away in crates and containers arriving daily from around the world. To the public, JFK was an airport. To Jimmy and his crew, it was the closest thing to a gold mine the city had ever seen. And it became the environment where Tommy began to understand the scale of the criminal world he had stepped into. This wasn't small-time hustling anymore. This was organized, structured, profitable, and infinitely more dangerous. Jimmy Burke had spent years perfecting the art of manipulating the airport from the shadows. He didn't run it, he just understood how to lean on the right people. Guys working in the terminals, loaders, supervisors, baggage handlers, all of them were regular men trying to survive on modest paychecks. Jimmy knew they needed extra money, and he knew how to offer it without making it feel like a crime. A few dollars here. A favor there. A quiet promise. A debt erased. Before long, entire portions of the airport operated according to Jimmy's influence. And Tommy was being brought directly into that inner system. Tommy's introduction to the air cargo rackets began with simple tasks: keeping watch while shipments were quietly redirected, escorting trucks leaving the terminal, helping coordinate timing between inside contacts and outside pickup crews. But even these small jobs felt enormous to him. The airport had its own pulse, busy, loud, constantly in motion. Tommy learned to navigate that pulse. The echoes of rolling carts. The shouts of workers. The steady rumble of aircraft engines vibrating through the concrete. He didn't blend in the way Henry could, but he learned to move with purpose, not hesitation. And in that environment, purpose looked like legitimacy. To the outside world, he was just another young guy working odd airport jobs. No one knew he was being groomed for bigger moves. That he was slowly becoming part of a network designed to siphon off millions. One of the first major lessons Tommy learned was simple. The airport was predictable. Cargo arrived on schedule. Workers followed routines. Supervisors rotated shifts. Security could be tracked. And in the mob world, predictability meant opportunity. Jimmy explained it in his calm, fatherly way, never raising his voice, never exaggerating. "This isn't about strength," he'd say. "It's about timing. You hit when no one's looking because they think they already know what they're gonna see." Tommy listened. He absorbed the rhythm of Jimmy's thinking. He watched how Henry prepared the details, how insiders checked the manifests, how drivers coordinated quietly. It was an orchestra of quiet crime. And Tommy was becoming one of its instruments. The more time Tommy spent at the airport, the more he began to understand the psychology behind the racket. The workers weren't enemies. They weren't victims. They were collaborators, even if they didn't always know it. Some turned a blind eye because the pay was too good. Some stayed silent out of fear. Some simply didn't want to interfere with something they couldn't fully understand. And Tommy learned how to read each type. Approach the nervous ones with politeness. Approach the greedy ones with opportunities. Approach the confident ones with respect. Jimmy had taught him that effective crime wasn't about force, it was about influence. Tommy learned that quickly, though his natural temperament sometimes made these softer tactics challenging. He was more likely to push than persuade. Henry often stepped in to handle the parts of the job that required diplomacy. But when something needed to be done swiftly or decisively, Jimmy turned to Tommy. Tommy never hesitated to say yes. Not because he lacked fear, but because he lacked the mechanism that slowed other men down. The air cargo world also exposed Tommy to something he had never seen before. Big money. Not a few $100s. Not 1,000. Not small payoffs tucked into envelopes. Real money. Stacks of cash. Bundles wrapped in tape. Large shipments worth more in a single night than most people made in a year. He saw how fast money moved. How easy it was to reroute a crate. How a distracted supervisor could be worth thousands. How a single inside man could make an entire job effortless. The scale impressed him. It excited him. It motivated him. Jimmy saw this spark in him and began giving him more responsibility, not official authority, but trust. And trust in the Mafia was everything. Yet Tommy's growing involvement came with a shadow. The more he became part of the airport operation, the more he became known outside Jimmy's circle. Other crews took notice. Other families took notice. The Gambinos, the Bananos, the Columbos, anyone with a stake in airport operations kept an eye on the young men rising under Jimmy Burke. And Tommy stood out because he didn't blend in. His personality was too big. His name circulated too fast. His presence was too memorable. Most young associates learned to be invisible. Tommy was unforgettable. That was useful when Jimmy needed intimidation. But it was dangerous when rival families started whispering his name. The air cargo rackets also taught Tommy something else. How deception worked inside the Mafia. Not betrayal. Not backstabbing. Just the everyday deceptions that kept operations smooth. No one said exactly what they meant. Instructions were half-spoken. Plans were disguised as casual conversations. Warnings were hidden in tone, not words. Tommy learned to read these signals. He learned when Jimmy wanted him close and when Jimmy wanted him to stand back. He learned that silence didn't mean approval, it often meant calculation. He learned that Henry's calmness wasn't weakness, it was protection. The airport showed him that the Mafia was less about violence and more about subtlety. Control. Influence. Timing. And the unspoken understanding that every man was only as secure as his usefulness. One of the most important realities Tommy learned, and one that would eventually shape his fate, was this. Air cargo rackets connected everyone. Not just the Lucchese crew. Not just Jimmy's associates. But other families. Other crews. Other interests. Money crossing hands meant alliances. Alliances meant expectations. And expectations meant consequences. If you disrupted the balance. If you angered the wrong person. If you stepped outside your lane. The entire structure could shift against you without warning. Tommy didn't fully grasp this yet. Not deeply. Not in a way that shaped his decisions. But the seeds were planted. Still, for now, Tommy's involvement brought him pride. He felt trusted. He felt needed. He felt like he was rising. Jimmy treated him like a valuable member of the crew. Henry relied on him. The airport workers respected him, sometimes out of fear, sometimes out of necessity. Tommy felt larger than life. Important. Connected. This feeling, this sense that he was becoming untouchable, fueled his ambitions. He began to imagine a future where he was more than an associate. Where he had more than a reputation. Where he earned not only respect, but status. He didn't know then that ambition was often the first step toward disaster. But the momentum was there, pulling him forward, deeper into a world that rewarded boldness and punished. Chapter 7, Vanishing Boys, The Disappearances Begin. As Tommy DeSimone moved deeper into the world of Jimmy Burke's airport rackets, the neighborhood began to shift in ways that were hard to ignore. Not on the surface, the bars still buzzed with late-night conversations, the streets still echoed with laughter from stoops, and the social clubs remained busy with the usual faces, but beneath it all, something subtle and unsettling had begun to ripple. Young men around the edges of the criminal world were disappearing. Not in dramatic, headline-grabbing ways. Not with police sirens or public investigations. Just, gone. A friend didn't show up one day. A familiar face stopped appearing at the lounge. A rumor spread quietly that someone moved away, even though no one believed it. Someone's jacket hung untouched in a closet at home. Someone's mother sat by the phone waiting for a call that never came. The disappearances didn't create panic, not at first. This was the mob. People vanished. Sometimes by choice, sometimes by consequence. It was the nature of the life. But these weren't made men. They weren't major players. They weren't rivals. They were associates, errand runners, young guys who stood too close to something or said too much to the wrong person. And each disappearance seemed to travel along the same quiet fault line. Their connection to the airport operations. Tommy sensed the shift long before he understood it. He could feel tension in the way certain conversations ended abruptly when he entered the room. He noticed the way older wise guys exchanged glances when someone's name was mentioned. He heard the whispers in the back of Robert's lounge, not loud enough to catch specifics, but tense enough to recognize that something important remained unsaid. Jimmy never addressed it directly. He didn't need to. In the mob, silence often conveyed more truth than words. And Tommy had learned to read silence. Still, these disappearances did not seem to frighten him. If anything, they made him feel more embedded in the life. The deeper he went, the more he believed he belonged. Danger was part of the air he breathed, a steady background noise he no longer noticed. But for Henry Hill, the shift wasn't subtle at all. Henry sensed danger quicker than most people. He felt the temperature drop whenever certain names were mentioned. He understood the unspoken message. Jimmy's operation was tightening. Loose ends were being dealt with. And the consequences were increasing. Henry wasn't paranoid, he was perceptive. And he saw a pattern Tommy didn't. The first disappearance that caught Tommy's attention happened casually. A familiar face, a young guy named Jackie, simply stopped appearing at the bar. Jackie wasn't a major player, he ran small errands, placed bets, and occasionally helped with airport drop-offs. He was young, energetic, and always eager to impress the older men. One night he was at the lounge, laughing loudly, telling stories with hands flying through the air. The next night, his seat was empty. And the night after that. And the next. No one asked. No one needed to. The empty seat said enough. Tommy didn't dwell on it. He kept moving. In his world, people sometimes disappeared for reasons no one wanted to explain. But Henry noticed Tommy's eyes drift toward the seat a few times. He noticed the unspoken question. He noticed Jimmy watching Tommy's reactions carefully. Because Tommy was still learning that the mob's quietest lessons were also its most serious. More young men disappeared over the next year. Some were associates from Jimmy's crew. Some were from nearby neighborhoods. Some were names Tommy barely knew. Some were names he knew all too well. What connected them? Not friendship. Not rivalry. Not personal conflict. They had something else in common. They became liabilities. Maybe they talked too much. Maybe they took more money than they were allowed. Maybe they asked the wrong questions. Maybe they were unreliable. But in the Mafia, a liability didn't need to be proven. It only needed to be suspected. Tommy wasn't responsible for these disappearances, he wasn't high-ranking enough, but he was present while the consequences unfolded. He heard the murmurs, saw the quiet tension, felt the shift in the atmosphere at Robert's lounge. Yet he moved through it with the same confidence, the same impulsive swagger that defined him. Jimmy didn't shield Tommy from this growing darkness. But he also didn't involve him in the decisions. Jimmy believed in protecting young associates from responsibilities they weren't ready to carry. And to Jimmy, Tommy was still a kid. A loyal kid, a useful kid, a fearless kid. But a kid nonetheless. But some disappearances hit closer to home. One young man, Frankie, had been friendly with Tommy. They worked similar jobs. They moved in the same spaces. They shared drinks, stories, jokes, frustrations. The kind of fleeting friendships built on proximity and routine. Then Frankie vanished. No warning. No explanation. No body. Just gone. Tommy didn't ask out loud, but Henry could see the question in his eyes. Not fear, curiosity. Tommy didn't fear the consequences. He feared the unknown. He didn't like loose explanations, didn't like uncertainty. He liked clarity, even when clarity was ugly. Jimmy, noticing this, pulled Tommy aside one evening. Not to explain anything, but to offer a quiet truth spoken in the coded language of the mob. Some people don't fit the life. That was all he said. He didn't elaborate. He didn't mention names. He didn't need to. Tommy nodded. He didn't push. He didn't ask. As much as he craved action, he respected Jimmy's boundaries. But inside, something flickered. A realization that the world he lived in didn't just reward loyalty. It demanded silence. It demanded obedience. It demanded emotional numbness where others demanded empathy. And Tommy, shaped by a lifetime of volatility, adapted without hesitation. Meanwhile, the FBI began taking notice. Not of Tommy specifically, but of the pattern. Missing young men tied to airport corruption. Local detectives caught glimpses of the connections. Workers at JFK whispered theories under their breath. Family members filed missing persons reports that led nowhere. No one could prove anything. No one could point to a single suspect. No one had evidence strong enough to act on. But rumors traveled. And as the rumors spread, So did the shadow that followed Tommy's crew. Tommy never heard most of these whispers. Jimmy did. Henry did. The FBI certainly did. But Tommy? He saw only the world in front of him. The jobs, the money, the camaraderie, the late-night laughter. And the unspoken truth that the life was becoming more dangerous by the year. Still, despite the disappearances, the tension, the unspoken rules, Tommy's confidence continued to grow. He believed he was protected. He believed Jimmy valued him. He believed Henry respected him. He believed the Lucchese family saw his loyalty. And in many ways, he wasn't wrong. But he didn't yet understand that visibility came at a cost. That too much confidence could be mistaken for arrogance. That too much unpredictability could be mistaken for instability. That too much loyalty to one man could make others nervous. The vanishings weren't connected to Tommy directly. Not yet. But they shaped the environment he lived in. They taught him lessons he didn't realize he was learning. They set precedents he didn't realize applied to him. And they marked the beginning of a darker chapter. One where Tommy's name began to circulate in circles that were not impressed by his charisma. And not amused by his volatility. The disappearances were quiet. Whispered. Forgotten publicly. But in the Mafia, nothing forgotten stays buried forever. And these vanishings would eventually form the backdrop to the choices that led Tommy DeSimone. Chapter 8, A Web of Lies, Police Suspicion and Tommy's Manipulations. By the late 1970s, the atmosphere around JFK Airport had changed. What once felt like a smooth-running machine of inside deals and quiet arrangements now felt tense, pressured, and increasingly watched. The easy money was still flowing. The crates were still disappearing. The inside men were still cooperating. But something was different. Eyes were watching. Not the casual eyes of airport workers. Not the curious eyes of neighborhood kids. These were official eyes, detectives, investigators, federal agents, men who watched from a distance, wrote down names, collected patterns, and waited for opportunities. And slowly, quietly, Tommy DeSimone became one of the men they took interest in. Not because he had the biggest role. Not because he was the smartest. Not because he left evidence. It was because he was visible. Tommy stood out, everywhere he went. He laughed loudly. He argued openly. He entered rooms like a gust of wind. He shook hands aggressively. He demanded attention without realizing it. Investigators didn't need proof at first. All they needed was a name to circle. A personality that couldn't blend in. A young guy who didn't know how to disappear into the background. Tommy became that name. Police interest began subtly. A detective lingered a little too long outside Robert's lounge. A plainclothes officer sat in a parked car near the airport terminals. A stranger asked a few too many questions about truck schedules. Someone's cousin, working quietly as an informant, mentioned a young hothead always hanging around with Jimmy Burke. Tommy didn't notice these things. Jimmy did. Henry definitely did. But Tommy moved through life with a kind of restless confidence that blinded him to danger. If someone was watching, he assumed it didn't matter. If someone asked questions, he assumed they were harmless. If someone looked twice, he assumed it was normal. Police officers didn't need much to become dangerous. One loud moment. One recognizable face. One impulsive reaction. And suddenly the spotlight would burn brighter. But manipulation came naturally to Tommy, even if he didn't plan it. He could talk his way into or out of almost anything. If a cop asked him where he'd been, Tommy had an answer. If someone questioned his presence near the airport, he tossed out a believable excuse. If neighbors wondered about his late nights, he used charm to quiet their suspicions. Charm was Tommy's shield. Not subtle, not perfect, but surprisingly effective. He could be animated, funny, endearing. He could make people laugh even when they didn't want to. He could talk himself into seeming harmless. But charm only worked on people who didn't know him well. Investigators weren't interested in charm. They were interested in cracks. And cracks began to show. Tommy didn't like being questioned, not by police, not by civilians, not by anyone. Even mild curiosity irritated him. And that irritation translated into tension. Tension that investigators were trained to notice. People who were calm had nothing to hide. People who were irritated had something to lose. Tommy didn't realize he was broadcasting signals every time he grew defensive, every time he spoke too quickly, every time he acted too boldly. The spotlight grew. Meanwhile, Jimmy's operation continued. Money continued flowing. Shipments continued disappearing. Deals continued forming behind closed doors. But Tommy felt the atmosphere shifting around him, even if he didn't articulate it. He noticed fewer jokes in the lounge. He noticed more hushed conversations. He noticed Henry's subtle warnings. He noticed Jimmy's protective glances. Still, he assumed he could handle whatever pressure was building. Fear didn't come naturally to him. Suspicion felt like an obstacle to confront, not a cue to retreat. He trusted his instincts. He trusted Jimmy. He trusted his own ability to talk around anything. But the truth was more complicated. Tommy wasn't the kind of man who could lie low. He wasn't built for caution. He wasn't built for patience. And the more the police watched, the more Tommy's unfiltered behavior made him stand out. He became both an asset and a vulnerability. A man who could intimidate effortlessly. But one who couldn't disappear into the crowd when necessary. The web of suspicion around the airport rackets tightened with each passing month. Detectives collected notes. The FBI gathered reports. Informants whispered names. Truck drivers mentioned a young hot-headed guy often seen with Jimmy Burke. And in the margins of countless quiet reports, one description repeated. Tall, loud, unpredictable. Possible associate, Tommy D. Seen often at Robert's Lounge. Tommy didn't know these reports existed. But Jimmy did. Jimmy saw the writing on the wall. And that writing pointed toward danger. Not because Tommy had done anything to jeopardize the operation. But because visibility itself was a threat. Tommy's rising reputation, his unpredictable nature, his presence at the airport, and his involvement with Jimmy made him a potential weak point in a system built on invisibility. And the Mafia had no mercy for potential weak points. The disappearances of young associates had taught Tommy something he didn't fully understand yet. That the Mafia removed vulnerabilities before they became problems. Tommy didn't realize how close he was coming to being seen as one. The police weren't his enemy, but they created pressure. Pressure created risk. Risk created suspicion. Suspicion created consequences. And Tommy, for all his loyalty and confidence, was becoming a name whispered too often. He didn't feel endangered yet. He didn't feel watched deeply. He didn't feel the ground shifting beneath him. But the shift had already begun. And the next chapter of his life would show how closely the walls were closing in. Chapter 9, The Lufthansa Heist, The Score of a Lifetime. The air around JFK Airport changed forever in December 1978. For months, tensions had been building quietly, investigators watching, crews tightening their operations, whispers traveling through back rooms and bar counters, but beneath all of that, something bigger was forming. Something bold. Something dangerously ambitious. Jimmy Burke had been planning the Lufthansa heist for a long time. Not loudly. Not impulsively. But with the slow, meticulous patience of a man who understood the value of timing. Tommy DeSimone didn't know the full plan. No one except Jimmy did. But he knew something significant was brewing. He sensed it in the late-night meetings, in the abrupt silences when he entered certain conversations, in the way Jimmy's eyes seemed to focus deeper, sharper, more intensely than usual. Jimmy wasn't nervous, he was calculating. And when Jimmy calculated, the entire crew felt the shift. Lufthansa wasn't like the smaller airport jobs Tommy had grown accustomed to. This wasn't a crate of electronics or a handful of jewelry boxes disappearing quietly. This was millions, cash, gold, foreign currency, one of the biggest payouts the airport had ever seen. Jimmy had contacts inside the terminal. Workers who saw the shipments. Men who knew when the vault opened. Men who knew exactly how loosely the money was guarded. For months, information traveled quietly to Jimmy's table at Robert's lounge. Notes scribbled on napkins. Times whispered at the end of conversations. A passing comment from a baggage handler that revealed more truth than he realized. Jimmy took all of it in. Sorted it. Filed it into the structure building inside his mind. He wasn't impulsive. He wasn't reckless. His brilliance came from his patience. The calm, steady way he watched the world until the perfect moment revealed itself. Tommy admired this quality deeply. Where Tommy moved fast, Jimmy moved intentionally. Where Tommy acted instinctively, Jimmy acted strategically. And the Lufthansa heist would become the largest expression of Jimmy's strategy. A job so big it would shake the entire Mafia world. Tommy wasn't part of the planning meetings. Jimmy didn't allow it, not because Tommy wasn't trusted, but because Tommy's energy didn't match the delicacy required for preparation. Still, Tommy found himself drawn into the orbit of the heist. He caught glimpses of maps spread across tables. He overheard whispers about schedules and truck routes. He noticed men he didn't recognize entering and leaving the lounge in the late hours. Jimmy didn't hide the fact that something massive was coming. He simply controlled how much Tommy knew. But Tommy, for all his unpredictability, wasn't foolish. He pieced together clues. He sensed the stakes. He understood that he was standing near the edge of something historic, even if he didn't yet know how close he'd get to it. As the planned date approached, the atmosphere around the lounge shifted. The usual laughter softened. Conversations dropped in volume. Men avoided eye contact. Schedules changed. The airport felt tense too. Security guards more alert. Workers glancing over their shoulders. Trucks moving with an undercurrent of nervous energy. It was as if everyone, even those without knowledge, could feel a storm coming. Jimmy kept his composure with ease. His face calm. His voice steady. His movements deliberate. But the pressure around him felt like a held breath. A collective anticipation suspended in the cold December air. On the night of the heist, the world moved in slow motion. Tommy wasn't at the terminal. He wasn't in the truck. He wasn't on site. But he was awake. Alert. Sitting at Robert's lounge, back straight, eyes sharp, waiting for the phone call that would signal everything had gone right. Or terribly wrong. Henry was there too, pacing with nervous energy. He knew the stakes. He knew how much money was involved. He knew how many things could go wrong, even in a perfectly planned job. He also knew Jimmy's rule. If you weren't essential, you stayed out of the way. Tommy respected the rule, but the waiting gnawed at him. He wasn't patient. Waiting felt like punishment. He wanted movement, action, confirmation. Jimmy arrived late, quiet, focused. He didn't pace. He didn't fidget. He simply sat, lit a cigarette, and watched the room like a man reading a book only he could see. Hours passed. The world outside went still. A faint hum of traffic drifted through the window. Voices softened to whispers. Every tick of the clock felt louder than it should. Then the phone rang. Jimmy didn't rush to answer. He nodded to one of his men. A short exchange. A quiet confirmation. The receiver clicked back into place. Jimmy didn't smile. He didn't cheer. He didn't celebrate. He simply said, "It's done." Those two words changed everything. In the following hours, news hadn't reached the public yet. The world still slept. But in select corners of New York. Bars, social clubs, backrooms, dim hallways. A quiet buzz traveled fast. Jimmy Burke had pulled off the unthinkable. Millions stolen without a shot fired. A fortune vanished into the night. And though Tommy wasn't present physically, he felt the vibration of triumph echo through the entire crew. He wasn't jealous. He wasn't resentful. He was proud, fiercely proud, to be part of Jimmy's world. For Tommy, this wasn't money. This was identity. Belonging. Proximity to greatness. He believed this heist would elevate the crew for years to come. And perhaps elevate him personally. And in some ways, he was right. But in others, he was dangerously wrong. Because the heist didn't just bring wealth. It brought scrutiny. The FBI swarmed the airport. Detectives traced every known associate of Jimmy's crew. Names circulated. Faces were studied. Patterns were reviewed. And Tommy's name, whether connected directly or not, was already on the margins of too many unofficial reports. He stood out. He was visible. He had been seen too often with key players. He had been too loud, too bold, too noticeable. Even when innocent, attention was a threat. And attention was something Tommy had never been able to avoid. Jimmy knew the danger immediately. He grew quieter. More calculating. More protective of the operation. He told everyone to stay low. To avoid unnecessary movement. To appear calm. Henry listened. Most of the crew listened. Tommy struggled. Laying low wasn't in his nature. He paced. He talked too much. He asked questions at the wrong times. He walked with too much confidence and not enough caution. His visibility, once an asset, was now a risk. To the outside world, Tommy DeSimone still seemed like a rising star within a powerful crew. To the men inside the life, he was slowly becoming something else. A liability. Unintentionally. Unknowingly. But undeniably. The Lufthansa heist was the peak of Jimmy's brilliance. But it also marked the beginning of the end. Not just for the crew. But for Tommy himself. He didn't know it yet. He couldn't have known. But the heist that promised a kingdom would become the event that accelerated his downfall. Because in the Mafia, big scores brought big attention. And attention brought consequences. Tommy was stepping into a storm. He didn't see forming around him. Chapter 10, The Investigation Tightens, Detectives on the Hunt. The Lufthansa heist didn't just shake New York, it shook federal agencies across the country. Within hours of the robbery being discovered, phones buzzed from Manhattan to Washington. Agents reread old files, detectives redrew circles around familiar names, and task forces formed almost overnight. This wasn't another small-time airport theft. This was the biggest cash robbery in American history. And as the investigation spread outward like a tightening net, one name kept appearing in the background. Not as a mastermind, not as a planner, but as a familiar face. Seen too often in the wrong places at the wrong times. Tommy DeSimone. Tommy wasn't directly tied to Lufthansa. He hadn't touched the vault, hadn't handled the trucks, hadn't stood inside the terminal. But investigators didn't need direct involvement to build suspicion. They only needed patterns, and Tommy's patterns were loud. He was at Robert's lounge too often. He socialized with too many known associates. He appeared in too many informal notes written by agents who didn't even realize they were confirming each other's suspicions. Tommy, without meaning to, became part of the map. The FBI began by tracing the airport's workforce. They looked at handlers, manifest clerks, drivers, security guards. Anyone who may have seen or heard something. When a few workers mentioned small, vague memories of that tall loud kid hanging around with Jimmy's crew, the agents took notice. Not because Tommy was a suspect, but because Tommy was recognizable. Visibility is a risk. And Tommy had lived his life like visibility was a badge of honor. Agents learned his name slowly, piece by piece. Tommy what? DeSimone. Desi, something. The tall one. The one with the big laugh. The kid Jimmy likes. Names didn't need to be precise. Descriptions were enough. The label forming next to Tommy's name in the minds of investigators was simple. Possible associate. In federal work, that label alone could shift an entire case. Meanwhile, the cops didn't approach directly. They didn't knock on doors. They didn't question the crew openly. Not yet. They watched instead. Waited. Listened. Unmarked sedans rolled slowly past Robert's lounge at night. Plainclothes officers sat in parked cars near the airport, pretending to read newspapers. Agents walked through terminals like casual travelers, observing workers closely. The pressure was quiet. Soft footsteps, sideways glances, reports filed in silence. But Henry Hill felt it. He felt it like a drop in barometric pressure before a storm. Henry began lowering his presence. Moving with caution. Avoiding unnecessary trips to the airport. Jimmy Burke tightened his operations too. Fewer meetings. Shorter conversations. More signals, fewer words. But Tommy? Tommy moved through the pressure like it barely existed. Some men are built with an internal alarm. A sense that warns them when danger creeps close. Tommy didn't have that alarm. He had instinct, but instinct for confrontation, not caution. When Henry subtly warned him about police surveillance, Tommy brushed it off. They can watch all they want, he'd say, waving his hand. I'm not doing anything. And in a literal sense, he wasn't. He wasn't part of the heist. He wasn't moving stolen goods. He wasn't handling the money. But in the Mafia, perception mattered as much as truth. Police didn't need Tommy to be guilty. They only needed him to look involved. And Tommy always looked involved. Hands moving as he talked. Voice carrying across the room. Energy heating the air around him. He didn't realize investigators gravitated toward faces like his. Faces that stood out. Faces they remembered in a crowd. As weeks passed, agents began connecting Lufthansa to earlier crimes at the airport. Things that seemed unrelated now formed patterns. The Air France robbery years earlier. Several inside job thefts. That shared similar timing. The same clusters of men appearing around terminals. The same bars mentioned in informant notes. All roads led back to one place. Robert's Lounge. And who was always at Robert's Lounge? Who appeared in the same circles as the key suspects? Who never blended into the background? Tommy DeSimone. He wasn't a suspect. But he was becoming a character in the edges of the story. A shadow. A clue. A piece of the environment federal agents wanted to understand. And as agents began building their lists. Names, faces, associates. Tommy kept landing on those lists. Not number 1. Not number 2. But always present, always noted, always circled. The deeper the investigation went, the more Jimmy adapted. Jimmy was a strategist, not a hothead. He watched body language. He listened for tone. He noticed when conversations in the lounge suddenly paused. He could feel when the air changed around him. He began telling the crew to stay quiet. To stay low. To stay invisible. Henry complied immediately. He felt the danger in the pit of his stomach every time he saw a parked sedan or a man in a suit who looked out of place. But Tommy struggled with invisibility. Silence didn't fit him. Caution felt unnatural. He wasn't built to shrink into corners. And Jimmy began noticing this. He didn't scold Tommy. Didn't warn him harshly. But he observed, carefully. Jimmy respected loyalty. But he feared unpredictability. And Tommy had both in abundance. The tightening investigation created paranoia in unexpected places. Airport workers grew nervous. Some talked too much to the wrong people. Some said Tommy's name casually, mentioning him as the guy who hangs around with Jimmy's boys. These comments weren't accusations. They were casual remarks. But in the world of federal files, casual remarks turn into paragraphs. And paragraphs turn into pressure. Inside the airport, federal agents began asking quiet questions. Who's around at night? Who works with who? Who's always hanging around Jimmy Burke? And the same names resurfaced. The same patterns emerged. The same faces were sketched in mental notebooks. Tommy didn't know who was talking about him. He didn't know what was being said. He didn't know how his name traveled. But it traveled silently. Through whispers. Through rumors. Through memories. And the investigation thickened. Side streets around the airport grew tense. Bars filled with quiet conversations. Men who once joked freely now stared at the door between stories. People lowered their voices when discussing money. Jimmy's calls grew shorter, usually ending with, "Be careful." Not frightened. Not panicked. Just aware. Jimmy understood the FBI's rhythm. He knew how they moved. He knew how they watched. He knew how they collected evidence. And he knew Tommy didn't. One night at the lounge, Henry pulled Tommy aside. "You gotta slow down," Henry said softly. Tommy frowned. "Slow down what? I'm not doing anything." Henry lowered his voice even more. "I'm telling you, they're watching everybody. Don't give them a reason to look harder." But Tommy's confidence was a shield. Not thick enough to block real danger. But thick enough to blind him to it. "They got nothing on me," he insisted. "They can watch all night. I don't care." Henry did care. He cared because he understood something Tommy didn't. Investigators didn't need you to be guilty. They only needed you to be connected. And once connected, the life became much more fragile. As winter settled in, the investigation reached a point of no return. The federal government officially connected Lufthansa to Jimmy Burke's orbit. It was quiet, internal, not announced publicly. But it changed everything. The pressure on the crew increased. The tension in the lounge became constant. Eyes followed Tommy everywhere he went. Still, Tommy continued being Tommy. Loyal, loud, bold, unpredictable. And slowly, quietly, the people around him began to wonder if Tommy's visibility would become a risk. Too costly to ignore. Not because Tommy betrayed anyone. Not because he made a mistake. Not because he was disloyal. But because the world was watching him. And in the Mafia, visibility could be as dangerous as treason. The investigation was tightening. Detectives were closing in. And Tommy's margin for error was shrinking by the day. Chapter 11, The House on Somerdale Avenue, A Suburban Secret. By early 1979, pressure from the Lufthansa investigation had seeped into every corner of Tommy DeSimone's life. The bars he once breezed through now felt too quiet. The airport that once felt like a familiar playground seemed to hold new shadows. Even the streets of Ozone Park, once comforting, predictable, full of familiar faces, now felt uneasy, as if the ground underneath was shifting. Tommy didn't talk about this feeling. He barely acknowledged it even to himself. But it lingered in the background, a steady hum of tension following him from place to place. And though he refused to show it outwardly, even Tommy felt the need to step away from the noise sometimes. To breathe. To think. To recalibrate. Which was how he ended up spending more time at a quiet house tucked deep within a residential pocket of Queens, a house on Somerdale Avenue. It wasn't his home. It wasn't officially tied to the Lucchese crew. It wasn't connected to business. It belonged to a friend, a low-level associate who kept a modest, quiet life. A man who owed Jimmy a few favors. A man who understood the value of offering a safe place for someone in the life to lay low. The house wasn't luxurious. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't remarkable in any way. And that was exactly the point. The neighborhood felt miles away from the chaos of the airport or the tension of Robert's Lounge. Tree-lined sidewalks. Children riding bicycles. Neighbors waving politely across tidy front yards. A dog barking somewhere down the block. A world that existed parallel to Tommy's. Close enough to touch. But far enough that he never truly belonged in it. When Tommy stepped inside the Somerdale house, the first thing he always noticed was the quiet. Not the tense kind. Not the suspicious kind. The soft, natural quiet that comes from a place without danger. A small kitchen table with mismatched chairs. A couch that slumped in the middle from years of use. A refrigerator that hummed gently. A radio on the counter playing low-volume rock or old Italian music, depending on the day. Tommy wasn't used to this kind of stillness. He liked noise. He liked movement. He liked intensity. Yet in moments like these, when the outside world pressed too hard, he found himself drawn to the calm as if something inside him craved it. Tommy never stayed long. A few hours. Sometimes a night. But each visit carried the same pattern. He'd enter restless, pacing, smoking, adjusting his jacket, talking too fast. Then, slowly, the stillness of the house would begin to change his rhythm. His pacing slowed. His voice softened. His gestures grew smaller. He'd sit at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, staring out the window as if trying to imagine a different version of his life. He never said this out loud, but the people closest to him sensed it. Tommy DeSimone had two sides. The side the world saw, loud, unpredictable, fearless. And the quieter side he tried not to acknowledge. Thoughtful, searching, almost gentle in rare moments. The Summerdale house was one of the few places where that second version of Tommy appeared. But even here, the shadow of Lufthansa followed him. The man who owned the house occasionally asked harmless questions. "You doing okay, Tommy? Everything good with Jimmy? Hearing anything new about the airport?" Tommy never answered directly. He'd wave the questions away, change the subject, or slip into a story about something unrelated. He didn't trust silence enough to speak honestly. And he didn't trust the world enough to let his guard down completely. But the questions lingered. Everyone in the life felt the pressure. Everyone sensed the investigation tightening. Everyone wondered who the police would focus on next. And in the background, unspoken, was the knowledge that not everything was about the police. Some dangers came from inside. Some tensions came from rival families. Some consequences came from mistakes whispered quietly across social clubs. The air around the Summerdale house was calm. But the world outside it wasn't. One winter evening, Tommy sat alone in the dim kitchen, listening to the radio hum as he traced the rim of a coffee mug with his finger. Snow fell outside the window, blanketing the street in soft silence. The kind of night where the world felt paused. He stayed still longer than usual. His mind wandered back to the men who disappeared in the previous months. Jackie. Frankie. Others whose names he didn't say aloud. He wondered, just for a moment, if running with the crew had changed him more than he realized. If the volatility he carried inside had grown sharper in the shadows of the life. If he was still the kid he once was. Or if he had become something different entirely. The thought didn't frighten him. It intrigued him. Tommy liked transformation. He liked feeling bigger, stronger, untouchable. But change also created vulnerability. A concept he refused to acknowledge. The Summerdale house offered a temporary escape. But escapes never lasted long. Inevitably, Tommy returned to Robert's lounge. To Jimmy. To Henry. To the loud, chaotic world he felt destined for. And each time he returned, the reality of the investigation felt heavier. Detectives sat in their cars longer. Agents followed the trucks more closely. Informants whispered more frequently. Names circulated faster. Jimmy's eyes grew sharper. Henry's warnings more frequent. And the atmosphere more fragile. The house on Summerdale stood quietly, unchanged. A reminder that normal life existed somewhere. But not for men like Tommy. He could visit that world. Step into its calm for a few hours. Let himself imagine a life without pressure. But he could never stay. The life always called him back. And Tommy always answered. What Tommy didn't know. What he couldn't see in those brief moments of quiet introspection. Was that the walls around him were closing in from two directions. From the law, tightening its investigation after Lufthansa. And from the Mafia itself. Where whispers had begun to gather. Like storm clouds forming silently over calm streets. The Summerdale house was a sanctuary. But sanctuaries don't stop storms. Tommy's fate was shifting. Slowly, quietly. In ways he did not yet recognize. And soon, the calm he found in that kitchen would become the calm before the greatest turning point of his life. Chapter 12, The Disappearances Continue, A Crew Under Pressure. The weeks after the Lufthansa heist brought a strange, unsettling quiet over the world Tommy DeSimone moved through. Not the peaceful quiet of a safe neighborhood or a winter evening. But the quiet that follows an explosion. When the smoke hasn't cleared yet. And everyone waits to see what still stands. People were disappearing again. Not in crowds, not loudly, not with headlines. But one by one, quietly, like lights being switched off in distant rooms. Some were small-time associates. Some were guys who talked too much. Some were men who knew pieces of the Lufthansa job but not the whole picture. Some simply got too close to the edge. And every disappearance created a new ripple of fear. Tommy didn't talk about the vanishings. He didn't ask questions. Questions were dangerous. Questions implied involvement. In the Mafia, curiosity was often mistaken for guilt. But Tommy noticed. He noticed faces that should have been at the lounge weren't anymore. He noticed chairs left empty at card tables. He noticed jukebox songs playing to smaller crowds. He noticed the way Jimmy's jaw tightened when someone asked casually, "Hey, you seen so-and-so lately?" Jimmy would shrug. No idea. But the meaning sat heavy beneath the words. For Tommy, these disappearances felt different this time. Before, they were scattered. Connected loosely to airport rackets or internal misunderstandings. But now they were centered around one gravitational point. Lufthansa. And as much as Tommy tried to ignore it, everyone felt it. This was the kind of pressure that changed people. Not just the men who vanished, but the men still standing. Inside Robert's lounge, the tension grew so thick it changed the air itself. The jukebox played the same old songs. But they sounded quieter. Conversations were shorter. More guarded. More coded. Men who once slapped Tommy on the back and greeted him warmly now nodded with polite caution. Not fear, but distance. Jimmy, normally calm and controlled, seemed more focused than ever. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't panic. But he was thinking constantly. Calculating. Scanning the room with a level of caution Tommy had never seen in him before. And Henry Hill, always the most sensitive to danger, watched every face that walked through the door, as if trying to determine who might crack next. Tommy, despite his brash confidence, wasn't blind. He saw the change in his friends. He felt the shifting weight of the room. But he interpreted it differently. In Tommy's mind, the vanishing men weren't a warning. They were proof of loyalty. Jimmy protecting the crew by removing risks. He trusted Jimmy completely. The way a soldier trusts a commander. The way a younger brother trusts an older one. The way Tommy had always trusted the strong men around him. This trust blinded him to danger. The danger that the rules applied to him, too. In the midst of all of this, the FBI quietly intensified pressure on airport workers. Interviewing dozens of people who had once crossed paths with Tommy. Even if briefly. Someone would say, "Yeah, I remember him, tall guy, big personality." Another would mention, "He hangs around with Jimmy's crew." A third would recall, "He's always at the lounge on Lefferts." None of these statements were incriminating. Not on their own. But in the world of federal investigations, connections mattered more than actions. And Tommy was becoming a connection. One the FBI repeated often enough to keep in their files. Agents weren't after him specifically. He wasn't a major player. But he was visible. And visibility created vulnerability. Tommy didn't realize that a pattern was forming around him. Like the outline of a puzzle piece he didn't want to fit into. Meanwhile, inside the Mafia itself, the tension around Lufthansa was growing dangerous. The robbery had been too big. Too profitable. Too public. Too media-driven. It had made headlines for weeks. It had embarrassed airport security. It had put a spotlight on the entire underworld. And that spotlight didn't just land on Jimmy. It traveled outward. To his crew. To his friends. To anyone known to move in his orbit. To men like Tommy. In quiet back rooms. In dimly lit social clubs. In unmarked storefronts across Queens and Brooklyn. The old-school mobsters had begun discussing the fallout. They didn't talk about the money. They talked about the heat. And in the Mafia, heat is poison. It was around this time that Tommy noticed a strange shift in how certain Lucchese higher-ups treated him. He wasn't a made man. But he had always been respected. Valued. Protected. Seen as fearless and loyal. Now. Some of those same men watched him with a new kind of calculation. Not fear. Not admiration. But evaluation. Tommy didn't know what they were evaluating. He didn't know why they spoke more quietly when he approached. He didn't know why conversations ended abruptly when he arrived. He simply shrugged it off. Believing people were stressed. Worried about the investigation. Thinking too hard. In reality, the crew was deciding who was safe. And who was dangerous. In the aftermath of Lufthansa. And Tommy. Tommy was increasingly being placed in the second category. Not because he had done anything wrong. Not because he had betrayed anyone. Not because he was careless with information. But because Tommy's volatility. The same energy that made him fearless. The same personality that made him useful. Suddenly looked like unpredictability. And unpredictability was the most dangerous trait a Mafia associate could have. During an FBI storm, Henry noticed the shift earlier than anyone else. He sensed the tightening around Tommy. In the way older wise guys spoke about him. With too much caution. He sensed it in the way Tommy's name came up in whispered conversations. But never with specifics. Just tone. He sensed it in Jimmy's silence. Whenever Tommy entered the room. Henry pulled Tommy aside one night. Outside the lounge. Under the yellow glow of a flickering street lamp. "You gotta be careful," Henry murmured. Tommy chuckled. "I'm always careful." "No," Henry said softly. His eyes tense. "You've gotta shut up. Lay low. Let this pass." Tommy frowned. "Pass? What's gonna happen?" Henry looked at him for a long moment. As if choosing his words carefully. "There's too much heat. Too many people looking in. And when that happens, crews clean house." Tommy scoffed. "Jimmy wouldn't touch me." Henry didn't answer. He didn't need to. Tommy's confidence rested on loyalty. But Henry understood something Tommy didn't. Loyalty and survival were not the same. At the same time, the disappearances of lower-level associates continued like a distant drumbeat. Tommy noticed more empty seats at the bar. More unreturned phone calls. More names that people stopped saying out loud. He didn't connect the dots. Not to himself. Not to the buildup of pressure around him. He simply assumed the world was doing what the world always did. Removing weak links. He didn't realize the criteria had changed. Weakness was no longer defined by fear. Weakness was defined by visibility. And Tommy was the most visible man in Jimmy's crew. The quiet truth. The one hanging like smoke above every social club. Was that the Mafia was tightening internally. Even faster than the feds were tightening externally. The real danger wasn't the FBI. The real danger was the internal whispers. Whispers that said Tommy talked too much. Whispers that said Tommy was too wild. Whispers that said Tommy drew attention. Whispers that said Tommy might need to disappear. Like the others. To protect the crew. Tommy didn't hear those whispers. He was too busy living fast. Moving boldly. Trusting fully. But the world around him was changing. And in that world, trust was becoming fragile. Loyalty was becoming conditional. Survival was becoming selective. The disappearances weren't random. They weren't coincidental. They weren't accidents. They were signals. Signals Tommy didn't recognize. Signals that the life he loved was preparing to make a choice about him. Long before he knew a choice needed to be made. Chapter 13, Neighbors and Community, Unseen Warnings. As winter faded into the early months of 1979, the communities around Ozone Park, Howard Beach, and South Queens were unknowingly circling the edges of a story far larger than they realized. To them, life moved on as it always had, corner stores opening at dawn, commuters hurrying toward the subway, neighbors sweeping stoops, and kids playing stickball in narrow streets. It was a neighborhood built on routine. A neighborhood that liked predictable things. A neighborhood that valued familiarity. Faces you saw every morning, voices you recognized, smiles exchanged across driveways. Tommy DeSimone fit into that world in a way outsiders might not expect. For all his volatility, all his intensity, all his explosive charisma. He was, in the eyes of neighbors, a local. A kid who grew up there. A face they'd known for years. A young man quick with a wave. Quick with a joke. Quick with the kind of energy that made people feel like they knew him. Even if they didn't understand him. But lately, things had begun to shift. People noticed Tommy less often. He wasn't walking the sidewalks with the same intensity. He wasn't lingering outside the delis or leaning in doorways with cigarettes. His visits were faster. His waves were shorter. His laughter, when it appeared, sounded thinner. Like the echo of someone trying to hold on to something slipping through their fingers. Neighbors didn't know why. They didn't know about Lufthansa. They didn't know about vanishings. They didn't know about internal whispers. But they could feel something was changing. Neighborhoods have a way of sensing danger. Long before anyone speaks it aloud. People talked, quietly, in ways that didn't name the danger directly. Tommy looks tired lately, one woman mentioned while buying bread. He's moving around too fast, said a barber to a regular. He seems worried about something, murmured an older man outside a corner store. These weren't suspicions. They were observations. The small human details people notice only when a familiar face starts behaving differently. A few people even tried asking Tommy directly. You doing all right? Everything good, kid? You look like you got a lot on your mind. Tommy brushed these questions off with the usual confidence. Yeah, I'm good. All fine. Nothing to worry about. He'd offer a quick grin. Give a small shrug. Maybe crack a joke. But his eyes. The neighbors noticed. Held something tighter now. Not fear. Not guilt. Just tension. The look of a man carrying more weight than he wanted to admit. Meanwhile, local shop owners and residents began to notice things that didn't fit the usual rhythm of the neighborhood. Unmarked cars parked for long stretches with men sitting quietly inside. Unfamiliar faces lingering on corners, pretending to read newspapers. Strangers entering bars who didn't look like they belonged. People assumed these were city guys. Police or feds. Though they never asked. In places like Ozone Park. You didn't ask. You pretended not to notice. You minded your business. But you felt it. A pressure. A shift. A sense that life had become heavier around the edges. Tommy didn't speak to neighbors about the investigation. He didn't need to. The tension followed him like a shadow. He'd walk into a local market and feel the owner studying him. Not suspiciously. Just with concern. The way someone watches a young man who seems to be sinking into something unseen. He'd pass by a group of older men playing cards outside the cafe. And feel the conversation pause. Not because they feared him. But because they sensed the storm around him. They didn't know he was involved in anything major. They didn't know about the whispers inside the Mafia. They didn't know about his name appearing in quiet FBI files. All they knew was this. Tommy wasn't the same. His presence felt tighter. His movements quicker. His greetings shorter. As if he was rushing through life instead of walking through it. The community, in its own unspoken way, tried to protect him. Not directly. But through small gestures. People held doors for him longer. They offered him coffee on the house. They told him to take it easy as he hurried by. They joked with him gently, softening their tone. Because neighborhoods like this knew their boys. And Tommy, for all his rough edges, was still seen as one of theirs. But the warnings, those subtle, accidental warnings, were everywhere. Small comments like, "You be careful now, Tommy. Don't get mixed up in anything. Keep your head on straight, kid." These weren't questions. They were instincts. The kind of instincts people develop when they've lived long enough to recognize that danger sometimes hides behind familiar faces. Inside the neighborhood social clubs, the atmosphere was even sharper. Men who normally teased Tommy now spoke to him with restraint. Not because they feared him, but because they feared for him. A few of the older wise guys pulled Henry aside quietly. "You watch out for that kid. He's making noise without realizing it. He's too visible, that's not good for anybody. Tell him to relax, before somebody else tells him not to." But Henry couldn't control Tommy. No one could. Tommy lived through emotion. Not strategy. Through instinct. Not caution. And emotion had begun to cloud his judgment. He felt the tension around him, but believed he could overcome it through sheer will. He didn't recognize that willpower couldn't change the rules of La Cosa Nostra. Or the rules of federal investigations. Or the unspoken rules of survival. Tommy still believed loyalty was a shield. But in the quiet conversations drifting through the neighborhood, people sensed that shield was starting to thin. Some of the unseen warnings came from the community's silence. People who once invited him into conversations now avoided drawing attention to him. Not because they feared being associated, but because they sensed Tommy needed less visibility. Not more. Bartenders stopped asking him loud questions. Shop owners kept his receipts in their drawer rather than handing them over. Neighbors waved instead of calling out his name across the street. Small things. Quiet things. Protective things. But Tommy saw none of it as warning. To him, life was still moving normally. He believed the disappearances were distant problems. He believed the investigation would pass. He believed the tension in the air would dissolve with time. He believed he was safe. Because he trusted the people around him. What he didn't know was that the same community trying to protect him was also sensing something he couldn't. Tommy DeSimone was becoming isolated. Not because he had done something wrong, but because the world around him was moving him, quietly, carefully, to the edge of something irreversible. The neighborhood felt it. Henry felt it. Even the strangers watching from parked cars felt it. Everyone sensed the shift around Tommy. Everyone except Tommy himself. He still thought he had time. He still thought he had control. He still thought he understood the danger. But the truth was already forming around him. Like a slow, quiet eclipse. A shadow inching closer. A silence growing heavier. And an unseen warning. Echoing softly through the community. Something was coming. And Tommy wouldn't see it until it was too late. Chapter 14, Capture and Confession, The End of the Silence. As 1979 unfolded, the pressure around the Lufthansa heist reached a point where the entire underworld seemed to hold its breath. The FBI continued its quiet march across Queens and Brooklyn, interviewing workers, pulling phone records, revisiting old files, tracing every possible connection to Jimmy Burke's crew. The newspapers still ran occasional updates, reminding the city that millions were still missing and that someone, somewhere, knew more than they were saying. Bars murmured with speculation. Social clubs tightened their shutters. And every man connected to the life moved more cautiously than before. Tommy DeSimone didn't feel cautious. He felt restless. Not because he feared the FBI. He genuinely believed they had nothing on him. But because the world around him was shifting in ways he couldn't interpret. Jimmy was quieter. Henry was more protective. Some men stopped meeting in public places. Others vanished without explanation. And in the silence that followed, Tommy sensed a change he couldn't quite articulate. It wasn't fear. It wasn't suspicion. It was something deeper. A feeling that the life he had always understood was subtly rearranging itself. Into a shape that no longer included him. He would never say this aloud. He didn't even allow himself to think it clearly. But the subconscious feeling lingered. Something was coming. One evening, Tommy walked into Robert's lounge and immediately sensed the tension. Not loud tension. Quiet tension. The kind that sits behind people's eyes. Men stopped mid-conversation when he entered. Others glanced over their shoulders. As if checking who else had come in with him. Henry sat at the bar, shoulders stiff, staring into his glass in a way that told Tommy he was thinking too hard. Jimmy was in the back, speaking in low tones to two older men from the Lucchese family Tommy didn't know well. Tommy approached Henry. "What's going on?" he asked casually. Henry didn't look up at first. When he did, his eyes carried something Tommy didn't expect. A mix of concern and something heavier, almost resignation. "Nothing," Henry said softly. "Just a lot of noise from the heist. People are nervous." Tommy shrugged. "Nervous about what?" "Nobody can prove anything." Henry didn't respond. Not because he didn't have an answer. But because the answer couldn't be spoken freely. Some truths didn't belong in open rooms. Later in the night, Jimmy called Tommy over to the back table. His voice was calm. His face steady. But his eyes. They were different. He told Tommy he was sending him on a job. Something simple. Something respectable. A meeting with some of the guys. A chance to smooth things over with the Gambino family. A chance, Jimmy said. For Tommy to finally get what he'd always wanted. To be made. The words hit Tommy like lightning. Made. Official. A real member of the Mafia. Not just an associate. Not just a soldier. Not just the wild kid with a reputation. This was the dream he had carried since he was young. The dream that had shaped his loyalty. The dream that made him believe everything would eventually fall into place. Jimmy said it with calm certainty. They want to see you, Tom. It's time. Tommy felt pride surge through him. A rare, quiet pride that softened his usual intensity. He didn't know that Henry, sitting only a few feet away, felt his stomach drop. Because Henry knew the truth. Jimmy knew the truth. Most of the crew knew the truth. But Tommy was the only one who believed the offer was real. The Mafia had rules. And one of the biggest was simple. No one can be made if they've ever killed a made man. Tommy had killed two. Billy Batts and Ronald Foxy Jarove. Both tied to the Gambino family. Jimmy had protected him for years. Hidden it. Deflected blame. Kept Tommy close and out of reach. But now, with the Lufthansa heat building, with associates disappearing, with families demanding accountability, and with Tommy's volatility becoming a liability, Tommy's protection was evaporating. The Gambinos hadn't forgotten. They hadn't forgiven. They had simply been waiting for leverage. And Lufthansa gave it to them. The next morning, Tommy prepared for what he believed was the most important day of his life. He dressed carefully. Shoes polished. Shirt crisp. Hair combed back neatly. He told his wife he had a meeting. Nothing serious. Something routine. He left the house with a strange mix of excitement and calm. Almost serene. For the first time in his life. He felt like everything was finally aligning. Henry watched him pull out of the driveway from across the street. Watched the car turn onto the main road. Watched the taillights fade into the distance. And Henry felt something he couldn't shake. This was the last time anyone would see Tommy DeSimone alive. Hours passed. Then days. Then a week. No calls. No messages. No sightings. Tommy, who had once stormed through the neighborhood with unstoppable energy, was suddenly gone from the world without a trace. Some of the crew played dumb. Some acted like nothing was unusual. Some pretended they didn't notice the absence. But the truth sat heavy in every room. Tommy wasn't coming back. Henry tried asking Jimmy what had happened. Jimmy gave him a look. One that said everything without saying anything. "You know how it is," Jimmy murmured. And Henry did. He understood the code. He understood the consequences. He understood the weight of old sins catching up. Tommy had walked into his fate. Believing he was going to be honored. Only to meet the quiet end that came for so many men in the life. Once they became too visible. Too unpredictable. Too costly to protect. There was no announcement. No ceremony. No funeral. No grave. Only silence. The same silence that had followed the others. The same silence that had grown thicker since Lufthansa. The same silence that told Henry, Jimmy, and everyone else that a chapter had closed. Not front-page news. Not police reports. Just the quiet, heavy ending of a man who had lived too loudly. For a world that required quietness. And in that silence, the truth became clear. Tommy DeSimone's story had reached its final turning point. He trusted the wrong promise. He believed loyalty would protect him. He believed the Mafia would reward him. But in the end, the life he loved became the life that swallowed him whole. Without a word. Without a trace. Without a goodbye. Chapter 15, Reflections on Evil, Lessons and the Human Psyche. In the weeks after Tommy DeSimone vanished, the underworld of New York continued spinning, as it always did. Bars opened. Cars rolled down crowded streets. Social clubs whispered through late-night hours. The city itself didn't stop for anyone, not even for a man as notorious as Tommy. But for those who knew him. For Jimmy. For Henry. For the countless people who crossed his path. Tommy's disappearance marked the end of an era. He had been part of a generation of men who lived fast. Who believed loyalty was unbreakable. Who believed violence created respect. And who believed their stories would be remembered forever. And in a strange way, Tommy was remembered. But not for the reasons he imagined. He was remembered because he embodied something larger. The tragedy of a life lived without reflection. The danger of believing that fear equals power. And the quiet reality that even the loudest men can disappear without a single trace. In the months that followed, Henry found himself thinking about Tommy often. Not just the unpredictable, explosive version of Tommy that everyone else knew, but the quieter glimpses he occasionally saw. The late-night conversations. The rare moments of calm. The flickers of vulnerability that slipped through in between storms. Henry wondered what Tommy could have been. If he'd been born somewhere else. Raised around different influences. Guided by more stability and less chaos. Because beneath the volatility, there had been intelligence. Charisma. Loyalty. And a strange, unwavering sense of identity. But all of that had been shaped. And ultimately destroyed. By the world he chose to serve. A world where reputation mattered more than character. Where silence mattered more than truth. Where fear mattered more than understanding. A world where a young man could confuse violence for strength. And mistake loyalty for invincibility. As time passed, Henry began to see Tommy not as a friend or a brother in arms. But as a symbol. A reminder of how quickly a life can spiral when impulse becomes a language. And danger becomes normal. He realized something that took him years to articulate. Tommy wasn't born a monster. He was shaped into one. Shaped by a violent neighborhood. Shaped by the expectations of the Mafia. Shaped by men who rewarded aggression and punished hesitation. Shaped by a world that saw rage as bravery. And unpredictability as usefulness. Tommy learned the wrong lessons from the wrong teachers. And once he learned them, he lived them with complete conviction. That conviction was the very thing that sealed his fate. Jimmy, on the other hand, never spoke Tommy's name after the disappearance. Not in bars. Not in back rooms. Not even in private. He buried the memory the way the Mafia buried problems. Quietly. Efficiently. With no emotion left on the surface. But those who observed Jimmy closely noticed a subtle shift in him after Tommy was gone. A heaviness. A sharpness. A tightening of the man who once seemed unshakable. Jimmy had cared for Tommy. In his own way. He had mentored him. Protected him. Used him. Guided him. And whether Jimmy admitted it or not, Tommy's disappearance was the first moment when Jimmy truly understood that even the strongest men could be outmaneuvered by silence. The community, too, felt the shift. Neighbors who once saw Tommy racing down the street, full of energy and swagger, now felt that absence like a missing sound in a familiar song. He was wild, they'd say years later. But he was ours. People remembered him not as a criminal. Not as a gangster. But as the kid who grew up around the block. The one who waved at shopkeepers. Who laughed with friends. Who moved with the kind of restless life that made him unforgettable. They didn't justify what he'd done. But they didn't erase the human parts of him either. Because in neighborhoods like people understood better than anyone that good and bad often lived in the same heart. Sometimes inches apart. Sometimes touching. Tommy DeSimone was a reminder of that complexity. Meanwhile, the FBI eventually closed their files. Not officially, but quietly, letting the case drift into the background. The way unresolved stories often do. They suspected what had happened. But the Mafia was a wall too thick to penetrate. Too tight-knit. Too practiced in silence. No body was found. No witness came forward. No confession surfaced. Tommy's name simply faded from their reports. The way his existence faded from the world. In the end, he became exactly what the underworld wanted him to be. A ghost. A man who once burned too brightly. And then vanished too cleanly. To leave anything but questions behind. Years later, as Henry Hill began cooperating with authorities, Tommy's name resurfaced in interviews. In testimony. In quiet recollections whispered across tables. Even then, Henry spoke of Tommy not with judgment, but with a strange blend of sadness and inevitability. He was dangerous, Henry would say. But he was loyal. And in our world, that's the saddest thing. It was not an excuse. It was a truth. A truth about a man who was both a product of his world and a victim of it. A man who wielded violence with reckless confidence, yet lived with the fragility of someone who never learned another language. A man who believed the life would reward him, until the life decided it no longer needed him. And so, Tommy DeSimone's story ends where so many Mafia stories end. Not with closure. Not with justice. Not with clarity. But with a quiet reflection on what it means to live in a world designed to consume men like him. His legacy is complicated. Part cautionary tale. Part tragedy. Part stark reminder that charisma without direction can become destruction. But more than anything, Tommy's story forces us to reflect on the nature of evil. How it's formed. How it grows. And how it hides inside people long before it reveals itself to the world. Some men are born monsters. Others are shaped by environment. Others still are created through fear, influence, and survival. Tommy was all three in different moments. And the silence that swallowed him remains the final chapter of a life that burned too intensely to ever end quietly. Yet somehow did. A disappearance without answers. A legacy without closure. A reminder that in the world of organized crime, the loudest men leave the quietest endings.